What does the scouter say about his power level?
It's over 9,000!
What, 9,000? There's no way that can be right.
What about context, and how is the power level distributed, and is it enablers or payoffs? Hi everybody, welcome to another episode of Lucky Paper Radio. My name is Andy, and I'm here, as always, with my co-host, Anthony. Hasn't even blown up his house a little bit, Maddox.
Not yet.
Not yet.
One day it'll happen. It's gonna happen one day. I'm gonna explode my house a little bit, and I know it's a when, not an if, and I'm just trying to do my best to be safe and stave it off for as long as possible.
Why are you so convinced you're gonna have to partially explode your house at some point?
It's just gonna happen. Look, these things just happen. These things happen.
I don't like pressure vessels. They make me nervous.
Or when you say pressure vessels, you don't mean necessarily a well-designed vessel designed for pressure. You mean a vessel under pressure.
I don't like either.
Okay, great.
Like friends that have an Instant Pot, it makes me anxious. I'm like, it's just right there.
Really? Even a pressure cooker, huh? Okay.
I've considered...
Those don't explode that much. When they do,
nice ones
they can go into the ceiling in very interesting ways. You can see them on the internet.
It's like an anxiety. It's the definition of an anxiety in that it is completely irrational. Sure, you could tell me that like it's perfectly safe or whatever. I'm just saying my brain looks at it and is like, no thank you. No thank you to the pressure vessels. Like, I have considered before getting a like commercial seltzer setup in my house, the way that like bars have.
As have I.
If you research this, you'll know that what that basically constitutes is like a extremely high pressure CO2 tank that is not that much larger. It's like usually basketball size roughly, and it is round because it is under extraordinarily high pressure. I'm pulling this completely out of my butt, but I want to say it was like 1,000 psi or something of carbon dioxide in this tank, liquid carbon dioxide, which every bar on the planet has one or whatever, but I would be very nervous walking past that every day on my way to my office in the basement, walking past the pressure vessel full of 1,000 psi. You have to get a little alarm to put near it because if it springs a little leak, it'll just replace all the air in your house.
Right. I mean, but
CO2.
That's not I was going to say that's not a safety issue.
It will kill you.
A physical trauma issue. That's just a suffocation issue.
It's just a suffocation issue.
Oh, man. I just saw a quote of, people on Fox News saying, CO2 isn't toxic. We breathe it out. These people are so fucking stupid. Anyway, CO2 will poison you through suffocation and other issues. Safety.
Anyway, pressure vessels. Just you trying to find a segue?
I'm doing a lot of fermentation projects, as I'm sure you know if you've listened to the show before, and some of them are under pressure deliberately to like carbonate some kombucha, for example. And one day I'm just going to get it wrong and it's going to explode.
Matthew, I really liked the way that Anthony just said carbonate some kombucha. Can you just clip that for me?
Carbonate some kombucha.
No, you had a much better tone. Just clip that for me. Maybe drop it in here once for the listeners, just so they can hear it again. And then I'm going to need that sent to my DMs for my own purposes.
What was the reason for that?
You'll find out later. It was cute.
Okay, great. And I also have a little bit of context. I joined a Discord that's full of food people a while ago, and they started talking about, referencing the incident. And I'm like, what's the incident? And they link back to an old post of somebody whose entire kitchen is covered in purple. They had just two, small, quart-sized jars of fermenting berries, which is, something I've tried before, that had gone wrong, exploded, and splattered fermented berry all over their entire kitchen. And then, it was 2 years later, and they're like, we finally finished redoing our kitchen because everything was purple and everything in it was destroyed.
Wow.
I'm less, again, worried about personal safety. It's unlikely I would just happen to be in the basement just staring with my face against my ferments. I'm only doing that
a lot.
A small percentage of the day if we look at the whole time of the day, but
it's
every morning I go down and I'm like, is today the day?
It's kind of like the server downtime issue though, right? Like you see that web hosts will say 99% uptime, and then you're like, well, actually, 1%.
That's like 2 days a year.
Is a lot. Is a lot of downtime. That's not acceptable at all. It's like if you're only looking at the ferments 1% of the time, that's still a lot of time looking at the ferments.
But if you want to make really delicious ferments, you want this extreme variety of delicious flavors, you just got to take that risk.
Your basement is well set up to handle an explosion.
Great. That's why
if your basement got covered in beet juice or whatever, pickled beet juice, it would be fine. And it would just be kind of funny. You could show people and be like, look what I did. Haha. Fermenting things under pressure, that means that sometimes values go from low to really high in a short period of time. And we talk about things that go from low to really high when we talk about the power level band of cubes.
Do you have a stinger to play?
It's time for Power Level Band of Cubes.
Rest in power. It's all about power.
I think this is something that we sort of talk around, or like it is just like fundamental to so many conversations about Cube, is this idea of how big in this cube is the power band. But maybe it's a term that we don't often really define, and I think it's actually like a really complex and subtle term and subtle thing to think about both as a cube designer, and I've really been feeling this a lot just because I've played a number of cubes in the last couple weeks that just have a huge power band, like intentionally from the designers, and it really impacts the way the cube plays, the way it feels, the kinds of strategies you're going to go into a cube with. So I think it's worth really just addressing this head on, at least for the first time since like 2021 or whenever we last talked about it.
Yeah, you mentioned this as a topic. I'm sure we've done this before,
Yeah,
but
me
I didn't
too.
even bother to look up when it was because I also feel like my perspective on this has probably changed quite a bit, or at least how I will articulate my perspective on this. So even if we're covering, well-trod territory for the podcast, it behooves us to occasionally sort of reset and just take a look at a subject like this with our most recent eyes and experience.
Yeah, so how do you define power level? It's not a thing that's written on the cards, and yet it's something that I think is...
A lot of cards do have a power.
Okay, well, fine. Oko, Thief of Crowns, does not have a power written on there, and yet I think that it is something that is like really fundamental to the way that we talk about Magic cards, and I think that even if we were to like sit down and try and like ascribe a specific power level, like our card evaluation skills wouldn't necessarily be the same, even not necessarily a value judgment that one of us would be better or worse, we would just have different opinions, and yet it's still worth sort of talking about this idea in the abstract of like cards having different relative power levels, and when we put them into a cube, that relationship is meaningful.
Yeah, I think the power level distribution discussion is largely governed by the societal constructs of like players and like the player mindset. Like when someone asks, what's the power level distribution in this cube, they're asking like, okay, what's the best card, what's the worst card, and what they're thinking in their head is how do I get more of the best card so that I win more, right? And so I think you can like simplify it to like, what is the power level band of a cube? It's the delta between the card that has the greatest negative impact on your win percentage if you put it in your deck, and the card that has the greatest positive impact on your win percentage if you put it in your deck. The best and worst cards in the cube for winning games of Magic. As a cube designer, I think more and more, I just don't care about this at all, honestly. Like, I don't think that delta actually tells you almost anything relative to other details about how power is distributed across the cube. I think it's truly like a player-focused thing that just, as a cube designer, more and more my attitude is like, I actually don't care if it's a wide power level band, a narrow power level band, if it's got, a couple huge power outliers. Like, I care so much more about the nature of those power outliers, the way they're distributed throughout the cube, what their sort of play patterns are, and how they either mesh or don't mesh with the goals of the particular environment.
Yeah, I think that largely no, I don't agree with you. I think that like
Great, we have an episode then.
As a designer and as a player, I think that there is like a really meaningful difference between a cube that has a very narrow power band and one that is much wider. I don't want to say one is better or worse yet. I think they both just have like interesting characteristics, but I do think it is really, really meaningfully different as a player. Do you think it'd be fair to say that like we could both look at two cubes? Like let's say let's pick a few concrete examples. Let's take my irregular cube and your sacred geometry cube.
Great.
They're pretty similar in a lot of ways. They play kind of like a limited set, but we could take every card in that cube and kind of like put it into a bucket of like, this is kind of the lowest fifth, this is the next fifth, and this is the most powerful fifth over here, and come up with some sort of distribution of how these cards fall. Would you say it's fair?
Yeah, we could do that. I would say that the way you described that, to me, like basically putting everything into fifths, like that's kind of like grading on a curve in a sense.
Exactly. I think that's exactly right, because we would have those two like buckets of 5 for the two cubes, but then we would still be able to step back and say like, okay, well, your top bucket in Sacred Geometry has Demonic Tutor, and you're going to tell me I'm wrong, but...
Swords to Plowshares, Lightning Bolt.
Plowshares. Okay, let me name some 4-mana creatures here. It's got Hero of Bladehold in it, and like big fun stuff you want to cast. And on the bottom side, like, what would you say is some of the least powerful, least impactful cards in Sacred Geometry?
Pacifism, Volshock,
Sure.
Morning Star, Miasmic Mummy.
Miasmic Mummy, that's a great example of a card that's not very powerful. So that's like a huge range. Mm-hmm. Whereas if we're looking at regular cube, it might be like, oh gosh, I don't even know. We got not Voyaging Satyr, the 2-mana 2/3 Vigilance, or the 2-mana 2/3 with Lifelink are some of the really powerful cards. And the bottom end is like pretty similar. Do you think it's fair to say that like we would have a much more narrow power band in the regular cube as opposed to Sacred Geometry?
Just to clarify, we're talking regular cube, not irregular cube.
Correct, yes.
I think you might have said irregular earlier. Maybe I misheard you.
So.
But I think it makes more sense to compare regular cube and Sacred Geometry, certainly. Yes, I think this is how we describe these two cubes in relation to each other on a recent episode of the show, and I think it's a very succinct way to, again, like, I agree that as a player, you should care. As a player, that does affect things about your draft. And so I think if you're describing these cubes to people, you're like, yeah, these are both cubes that are about playing relatively simple cards. They're about playing, kind of fundamental magic, like core set style magic. And one of the main differences between our two cubes is that I just have a lot higher tolerance for much more powerful cards, and in some cases, much less powerful cards. And yours is much more sort of a tight power level band.
Right, for sure. Even though we are not talking about a absolute objective metric of this card is a 7 versus this card is a 2, we can still pretty well agree when we look at and get our overall impressions of a cube that these distributions are real.
Yes, but that's not even what I meant by when I was making my comment about grading on a curve. Like, if you put everything into 5 equal containers for every cube, it might be that, between two cubes that are almost identical, actually in this cube, the first and second bucket are way more powerful. Then there's a big gap between the third, fourth, and fifth bucket, right? Like, I always picture power level as a curve, right?
Yes.
And, I guess we could assume, standard deviation. It's maybe something like a bell curve in a lot of cubes where you have outliers and then a big sort of chunk in the middle. I don't think it actually looks like that for a lot of my cubes, and I strive for it to look like a different shape. But that's important that if you imagine two different shapes, imagine a cube that just has completely equally distributed cards linearly across all the power levels. The power level graph is a line, a straight line, versus one that's a bell curve. If you put them both into groups of fifths, that would not tell you as much, I think, when you're comparing them side by side.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true, and I think that actually has a pretty big impact on the way the cube plays. It's not just what is the least powerful and what is the most powerful card, but what is that curve in between? So, yeah, there's two ways we could do that exercise. You could just say, give me the bottom fifth, give me the next fifth, or you could say, here are the benchmarks, here's the bottom, here's the top, put everything kind of where you think, and then we could kind of imagine building a histogram of what that curve is.
Yeah.
When I say histogram, I mean the same thing you could apply to a mana curve where you say in my deck I have 5 1-drops and then 7 2-drops, and you can build that little graph of literally just how many cards are in each stack. Again, I think it's important that this is a exercise that you could do. We're not dealing with real numbers, but it is to me really powerful to picture that idea of that histogram when I'm looking at different cubes.
And this is what I'm saying. That to me, as a cube designer, I care so much more about what that distribution of power level is than I do about the delta between the best and worst card.
Right, because you're literally talking about 2 cards if you're just talking about best and worst card.
Right, and I also think that the other thing I care a lot more about is the nature of that power level. Because as you said, I have Demonic Tutor in Sacred Geometry. It is, a high pickable card in the most powerful of cubes. It kind of hangs with everything, but it's also a card that scales with power level.
Right, yeah.
I've talked before, and I feel very strongly about the difference between a card with relative power level and absolute power level, right? Relative power level, for 2 mana, any card in your whole deck is relatively incredibly strong. In the history of Magic, that is kind of unprecedented rate for tutoring any card in your deck, which is why Demonic Tutor...
Unprecedented. Never seen before except in Alpha.
Except for when they did it. Never seen since, really, or only seen since with a bunch of additional costs, your Diabolic Intents or whatever. It is a incredible relative rate. Absolutely, you're just drawing a card. It's not actually absolutely doing anything compared to something like Hero of Bladehold you mentioned, which I think is relatively less powerful. I think Hero of Bladehold is going to contribute less to your win percentage than Demonic Tutor if you put it in the time-traveling supercomputer. Though I will say a lot of listeners, when we did our draft along of Sacred Geometry, felt differently. And basically, I don't think Demonic Tutor is that good in this cube, and it actually would not contribute that much to your win percentage in the time-traveling supercomputer sense. I think they're wrong, but whatever. Everyone's got a different perspective. It's just to point out there are other perspectives out there. But I think Demonic Tutor is, objectively the more powerful card, but it doesn't take over a game in the way that a Hero of Bladehold does. Some games, Hero of Bladehold, you'll just die before you get to second white, or you'll play it and they'll have a 1 mana removal spell that gets rid of it.
I can verify that.
Yeah, or it just gets flame slashed or whatever. The outcome of the game is really polar with a card like Hero of Bladehold. If it sticks and attacks a couple times, you're going to win basically no matter what. If it just gets immediately removed, then at a mana loss or you paid more mana for your threat than your opponent paid to remove it, then it's actually quite bad. That was a really bad exchange for you. By comparison, Demonic Tutor, I think, smooths everything. It's this is just going to make the games less extreme. You are now going to sometimes,
you're just going to win
not miss
more
your third
consistently.
Land. Your deck is more consistent, but it's more consistent in this very sort of... I think its principle still applies to the Hero of Bladehold Demonic Tutor comparison, but I think it's much easier to make this comparison when you're talking about creatures at different points in the mana curve, right? We had a whole episode years ago kind of comparing Ragavan and Lelia and talking about sort of their impact on powerful cubes at the time. And, any 3, 4, 5 mana creature should be absolutely much more powerful than any 1-mana creature, right? And my point about Ragavan, my sort of defense of Ragavan in my powerful cube was like, it's a 2/1. Has a bunch of upside when it attacks and hits your opponent, but like it trades in combat with literally every creature in the entire cube. It dies to literally every removal spell. There are so many ways that you can answer it, and then the game continues, right? Versus something that just has a lot of absolute power level. Let's say it's a card that there are no removal spells for. It's Emrakul, right? Once you get Emrakul in play, like the game is just over because there's like no real counterplay. There's no real texture to it. I think that idea between like, what is the absolute impact on the game of this card, regardless of cost, and what is the absolute impact of this card in the game relative to its cost?
Yeah, I mean, that definition makes a lot more sense to me.
I feel like I'm blabbering over here, but that's what I'm saying.
Absolute versus relative. When you say relative to the mana cost, then sure, that makes total sense. And I think that we'll definitely get more into the nature of what types of things are in that powerful seed, like also has a huge impact. But to take a step back and something you said a little bit earlier, you're also right that like the context is super important, and a card in a vacuum doesn't really have a meaningful, even this like abstract idea of power level doesn't make sense to apply to it. Because when you put it into a cube, like your Savannah Lions, put that into a cube with a bunch of other Savannah Lions, it'll be pretty powerful probably. Put it into a cube with no other aggressive cards, it'll be pretty crappy. And more than that, it's like, well, this card is situationally good, so it'll have maybe a very high ceiling and a low floor. So every card is kind of its own little puzzle, and you are kind of trying to, I mean, this is, to me, like what the joy of playing Cube is trying to sort of take all that information and say like, okay, here's a card, here's a pack of cards. I want to look through this whole thing, and given whatever context I have, figure out like what is the expected value of each of these cards? How do I suss out what that power level is in order to pick the highest number in this pack?
Yes.
So if we were to take a little bit of a step back into like what Cube looked like a few years ago, and maybe what we even said, I should have listened to that episode that we did years and years ago about a flat power level. I think generally advice was for a Cube, your goal should be to keep that power band pretty narrow. And I think there's some really meaningful arguments for that. Like, it can just feel dissonant to open up a pack and say, like, well, here's my Hero of Bladehold, and then here's a 4-mana 3/3 with maybe even a minor downside. It's like, it just feels weird to have those cards in that pack together. Are there any other downsides you see to having a really narrow power band?
Well, so real quick, I think I agree with the overall sentiment that, like, Cube designers, I think, would describe Cube as having a narrow power level band, but it's important to be relative to what? And it's relative to retail limited.
Sure.
Like Vintage Cube has an incredibly wide power level band compared to a lot of other cubes, but I think it's still narrow by the definitions of like, here's a format where you have, you know, insane A++ bombs that are basically unbeatable and cards you literally will never put in your deck because they are plants for some other format or whatever, right? Which is most Retail Limited sets. I mean, Retail Limited has gotten, I think, a lot more streamlined over the past few years, but you and I haven't played that much. But still, you're going to have cards that you just never want to put in your deck.
Right.
And you're going to have cards that at the end of the day, if you ask the people that, you know, grinded the limited set a whole bunch, they'd say, yeah, I kind of wish this card wasn't here because it like just, you know, completely takes over everything.
For sure.
When people say Cube is a relative power level, I don't think they ever meant, you know, kind of what you're describing for the regular Cube. I think they meant like compared to Retail Limited, where you're like, well, some cards are good, some cards are bad. They are like, all the cards are good. Like that is what they mean by narrow power level.
Yeah, I mean, which is a funny way to phrase it. Just be like, oh, just cut all the bad cards. Now all the cards are good. That doesn't really make sense because you still just have a different range. And I think when you're just cutting from the bottom, that range could be kind of warped. I don't know. I think that a lot of the advice that I felt like a few years ago was keep a flat power level because you want all the cards to get played. If you have just things that are all over the place, that 4-mana 3/3 that maybe has a cool synergy is just never going to get played if it's next to a card that just has this efficient rate that's just always going to make it an effective game piece regardless of what the board state is. And like, I think that's a real and valid argument. I like the way that our friend Zach Barish put it, where it's not so much that you want all of the cards to be playable or all the cards to be exactly the same. You just still want the cards to be in dialogue with each other. And if you have that really, really, really extreme situation, then yeah, the cards just don't make sense together. It's like, cool, 10% of these cards are just never going to make it into a main deck, but you can still have a fairly wide power band where the cards still make sense together and still play in a meaningful way where you can put both cards in your deck and not feel like a dummy for it.
That's kind of my point is like, I don't think it's actually the power level of the card, the like impact on your win percentage across time that really matters. Because again, I think Demonic Tutor in Sacred Geometry is completely fine. And I actually anecdotally had a game recently where I was playing kind of haphazardly with just like a friend very casually. And it was a Fact or Fiction pile, I think, where they made a pile and one of the piles included Demonic Tutor. And I didn't think, and I was like, well, of course I want Demonic Tutor. That's like the best card in my deck. And then I realized a turn later when I looked at my hand, it was like, wait a minute. No, the best card in my deck was in the other Fact or Fiction pile. Sure. it's not actually Demonic Tutor. Demonic Tutor just goes and gets something else, right? That's what I meant by sort of relative power level, right? What Demonic Tutor does is it draws a card. Obviously, it's the best card you could possibly draw in that circumstance, which is quite good, but it makes that card cost 2 more mana than it would cost otherwise. Like, cast any card in your deck, but you're paying 2 more mana for it, right? In an absolute sense, it's like not doing anything crazy. I think
maybe we're getting a little bit bogged down. Like, maybe Demonic Tutor is a bad example because its source of power is kind of like less obvious than just, here's my big creature that's attacking you and getting your life total to 0.
I think it's really important, though, because like the same thing is true of Ponder, of Preordain, of Brainstorm, of Source of Plowshares, of Lightning Bolt, even. Like, all these cards, I think, are very high in relative power level and pretty low in absolute power level.
Here's where those terms don't necessarily make as much sense to me, because now we're not necessarily talking about mana cost, but can we take a step back and again just talk about like advantages, pros and cons of flat power level versus very wide?
Sure.
So I think like a pro of a very narrow power band is like it's very easy for all of the cards to be in dialogue with each other and to have all the cards be like reasonably playable, reasonably main deckable. And I think that that is a reasonable goal. I don't think it should be somebody's only goal when designing a cube, but it makes sense that every card you put into a cube, you want to be there and actually see time played in games.
I guess this is my point, though. I don't think I necessarily agree to that fundamental premise because, again, if we're just looking at power level, I actually don't think that's a good metric for whether cards are in dialogue with each other or not.
That they all have some reasonable chance of making people's main decks?
I think the question of whether they make people's main decks has a lot more to do with like the psychology of a drafter. But if we just look at the time-traveling supercomputer impact on win rate, if they're just like all even, I don't necessarily think that's going to equate to like all the cards seeing equal play. I think there are so many other factors there.
Yeah, but can we just talk in this like big abstract sense? Like, do you not looked
example.
at a cube before and been like, hey, this like 20% here, these are just going to be in sideboards? Like, that's...
I for sure have, but if we're talking abstract, I think we need to be like thorough about it. Like, here's another example. Just imagine you have a cube where the relative power level, the supercomputer, impact on win rate has been measured, and it's exactly the same for all the cards, and half the cube is 5 drops. Then all the 2 drops are going to be much higher picks than the 5 drops, and you're not going to play all the 5 drops because there's just too many of them in your curve, even though the time-traveling supercomputer says these are all relatively the same power level.
Yeah. Sorry. It's like, I feel like I want to get to those details, but first I want to set the baseline of okay, so let's then look at extreme power band. I think that there is something that's really meaningful about that, which is that it's fun. It's exciting to open up the big, powerful, splashy card. And I feel like this is somewhat of a limitation in my main cube, in regular cube, because you can open up a pack and it's great that almost anything is like a somewhat defensible first pick, or like of 15 cards, maybe there's 6 or 7 reasonable defensible first picks. It also means you're not having those moments of, oh shoot, I opened up Black Lotus. This is incredible. And I'm really excited about it. And I think that, again, for me, that goes for, here's a really exciting 4-mana creature that's going to spit out a bunch of tokens. I love that. I want to do that. And I think that in the Vintage Cube, obviously, that's power. Like, you want to be opening up Black Lotus, and that's where those exciting moments come from. So to me, this is where I really see that sort of tension of, like, a flat power level, sure, it's nice. And when I say flat, I mean a narrow power band means it's easy for the cards to be in dialogue with each other. Yes, there's a lot of wrinkles there. It's easy for most of the cards to have some reasonable chance of making people's main deck. It's limited in the fact that it's not necessarily going to, just because of those individual cards, create the same kind of like exciting both draft moments and gameplay moments.
I think that that's a big part of the reason people love Vintage Cube, is they just want to play with Black Lotus. And you could make every game design argument that like, oh, actually the games are better and more interesting if you don't have Black Lotus in the cube, and that doesn't matter because people, they want to play Black Lotus in Vintage Cube. They want to play Time Walk, they want to play Ancestral Recall, and that's like the reason for playing a cube like that.
Yeah.
And that same principle applies to whatever your pet cube is. If you have some huge power outliers, it's like, yeah, this is a place where I want to play. We got to stop using Oko as our go-to.
We got to change it. It's
we're so
2026. We got to pick a new.
So it's now it's
Shorkai.
That's also really old at this point.
But that's a card that came up in a cube for me recently.
What should be our new power level pull? I mean, Fable the Mirror Breaker is still kind of old at this point,
too.
That's
very old. I was just listening to, on Recross the Path, someone who had a mono red cube talking about, like, well, and actually a designer at Wizards talking about, like, oh, there's nothing crazy in here. Like, the best thing is only Fable the Mirror Breaker and Ragavan. And I'm like, are there better red cards? No, maybe there are. Maybe in Final Fantasy. Yeah, so I think the other thing that sort of like key experience that I can relate to is as much as it is fun and exciting to open up the big splashy bomb, it can also lead to pretty frustrating gameplay if you're on the other side of that. And I think that that's the other negative aspect of a really wide power level band is having power outliers that are just so strong that they take over the game, they feel like they invalidate every choice you've made before, and now the game is just about you drew that one card and nothing else.
I feel like you're going to get frustrated with me, but this is where, again, I don't agree. I don't think people get frustrated when you cast Ponder, and Ponder is an incredibly powerful.
Saying Ponder.
Okay, well, I mean, but this is my point. My point is, I don't think the power level matters. I think it's the nature of the power level, right?
Yeah.
You could even be some, let's take like Carnage Tyrant is a card that I don't think is very good in the abstract time-traveling supercomputer sense, because it's 6 mana, and, there's plenty of ways to, like, get around it, or just go under it, or whatever, play a combo deck and ignore your opponent's creatures. But it's the kind of card that is extremely frustrating to lose to, because it's got hexproof and indestructible or whatever. It's basically like, you can't mess with me, so sorry that you have a handful of removal spells, but they don't work now.
Yeah.
You had a counterspell, but I can't be countered, right? And to me, it's like, I know that Ponder is a better card than Carnage Tyrant, and so for me, as a Cube designer, I don't care about like making a narrow power level band. I care about including cards where the absolute impact on the game is closer to a sort of flat power level, or flat level, basically. Like, I don't want individual cards at any mana cost to be like, well, now this game only revolves around that one card. Not because it's the best card in the cube or it's like a power outlier, just because that's the nature of, 6 drops or whatever. And that's why so many of my cubes are really low curving, because as you go up the mana curve, it's hard to justify playing a 5, 6, or 7 drop in any deck unless the game immediately becomes about that card, because it's cost so many resources to put into play.
I don't disagree with you about any of those things.
I just don't want to talk about it right now.
No. I just think you're jumping ahead of kind of the baseline I was hoping to set, because I really do feel like I have that experience, not constantly, and it's like I play a lot of cube, it's like I'm prepared for it, and it's like, cool. It's I want to appreciate that those kind of like big splashy moments can be both the fun thing and the not fun thing at the same time, depending on like what side of the board you're at. I think that what you're sort of jumping on is a bunch of these like mitigating factors to you as a very thoughtful designer can apply to kind of get the best of both worlds. Because yeah, I've definitely played games where my opponent just plays Shorikai in a cube, where otherwise I'm playing like a 3-mana 3/3 and hoping to curve out, and that's just the end of the game, and that can be fairly frustrating. So I think a couple things that you've mentioned that are really worth highlighting, because I do totally agree with you, is the kinds of cards that you make your power outliers really affect the psychological experience and the gameplay experience. A couple of them being, are you actually powering up like the things that are ending the game on their own, or powering up the things that are enablers? And I think that this is something, especially in your neoclassical cube, you're really deliberate about. So this is your, how would you describe it? Old border, mostly old school cube?
I think it's an old school cube. I mean, I do play some cards that were printed only in new border, but only when they fit the vibes. Like, every deck you can draft in that cube is a deck that makes sense and is compatible with people's perceptions of old school Magic.
Right. It's
okay that Burst Lightning wasn't printed in Invasion. It, theoretically could have been. Who cares that it's modern border is kind of my attitude towards it. But yeah, it's about old school Magic.
So I think that if we had a cube that's just like, it's a bunch of creatures and the 4-mana creatures are just like incredibly more powerful, then yeah, that's potentially going to lead to those frustrating experiences where if somebody just gets one of those huge creatures, that'll just take over the game. If instead you have this mixture of here's powerful threats and then maybe, or here's some medium threats, but like really powerful enablers, the texture of those games is still going to feel really different. Like in that cube, you're going to be casting Reanimate, like this really powerful spell, but sometimes you're going to be reanimating Twisted Abomination or Verdant Force, and like there is some interaction for those kinds of effects, so there's still going to be a lot of texture and variety to those gameplay, and it's not going to feel as much like the Brainstorm or the Reanimate is the power outlier that it might be if you could actually like run the numbers and see the game in hand win rate of those cards.
I've said this on the show before, but I definitely feel like that was one of the things I identified as like definitional to old school Magic. Like, people always say the creatures were bad and the spells were good. I think if you actually pick at that a little bit, the reality is that for the most part, the like enablers were incredible. The like removal spells, the card draw, the like things that would cheat something into play, like were all incredible. And what was bad was like all the payoffs. It was like, okay, well, yeah, like you said, you can reanimate something, but you'd get a Verdant Force, or you can tinker something out, but you get a like Phyrexian Colossus, right? Which I think modern Magic has skewed pretty hard in the other direction to like every card kind of just does everything a little bit, right? I've played some very powerful cubes with a lot of modern cards, and it just kind of feels like every card that's played is like the new card that the whole game is defined by, and everything that happened prior to that card being cast kind of doesn't matter anymore, and you just hope that you can then cast a card that, you know, invalidates your opponent's card they just cast. Like, it doesn't feel like there's as much interaction between strategies and like the cards in your deck when every card just is self-contained and enables itself and is a payoff and a win condition.
Right.
Anyway, I did find that was sort of a thing that felt like old school Magic to me, and, you know, there I have even included some newer cards that are enablers, but only power outliers again when they're like enabling something, not the actual payoff.
Right, and I think that example of like a reanimator card is a really, really potent example of this, because a reanimation spell always needs something else to pair with it. Like, you need to be able to put your Twisted Abomination in the graveyard to be able to reanimate it, so it's not really possible for Reanimate to be out of dialogue with the creatures in your cube. Like, it only works with those other cube, and I think the same is true with removal. If your removal is at a really high power level, of course it's still going to be in dialogue with the creatures in the cube, because it has
the dialogue is die.
It might be a short conversation, but like, the cards still make sense together. So it's like, I think it's cool when you can tune up the power level and have outliers in just certain types of effects, and it still meshes with other types of effects that maybe just exist on a very different power level in the whole world of Magic, looking at it as a single entity, but in your little cube environment, they still make sense together.
I'm sure there is a better term to refer to this concept of like absolute game impact. Can you think of a better way to describe that? Because I truly feel like we're having these kind of like two parallel conversations, and you're like, I had a plan. I was trying to like...
I did. It's all right here.
I was trying to set the table and like, you know, lay out this like relatively simple worldview where it's like powerful cards define games, and they're high picks, and they're exciting, and weak cards, you know, ride sideboards and are not that impactful. I just think that gets really convoluted with the idea of power level, because, you know, I see people that have a cube and they're like, well, I want to exclude the powerful cards, so I can't have Ponder. And it's like, well, you absolutely can't have Ponder. Like, Ponder's impact on a cube environment is wildly different than Minsk and Boo. You might look at the numbers of the Vintage Cube and maybe they're like dead even in terms of their like, you know, impact on win rate. That's possible.
I'd be a little bit surprised.
I have no clue, but it's theoretically possible. Like, I'm sure there is some dinky removal spell or cantrip that is right around, you know, Minsk and Boo power level in terms of impact on win rate, but the impact on what the games feel like could not be more different. One is like making your deck more consistent, making you not miss land drops, all things which are powerful. They're going to lead to more wins in the long run. But your opponent is not going to be like, well, great. I don't want us to even say it that way. It's not even like an emotional reaction. Like, you straight up will not invalidate your opponent's game plan by casting a Ponder. You never will, right? Whereas Minsk and Boo, if they don't have interaction for Planeswalkers, you could just invalidate their entire game plan. It's like, oh, sorry, you didn't happen to have an answer to this one type of card that I have, and it's so individually powerful that it just takes over the game.
And yet, you love Portent, a card which can invalidate
I do love Portent. I care so much more.
You have just like such a tuned reflex to be aware of all those nuances that it's easy for you to like jump ahead to those. But I think that those nuances are meaningful. And the fact that like you're very interested in the nature of those power outliers is important, but takes a lot of effort and experience to suss out.
That's what I want to sort of express, though, is as I've designed more and more cubes, if I look at my cubes right now, my longest running cube, the Bun Magic cube, definitely still among all my cubes has the narrowest power level band. It also happens to be the most powerful cube, but like I don't run cards that are like too bad there or like, you know, really sort of suspect. It's a high bar for inclusion in that cube. But I also, like, one of the sort of other defining characteristics of that cube is that it's very low curving. And I think what I was describing, like narrow power level band, eternal, high power level, and low curving, I'm just kind of dancing around the idea of like, I don't want individual cards to just absolutely take over the entire game, right? And so the way to do that is, yeah, include the most powerful cards, but like, Fabled Mirrorbreaker is insane. On the spectrum of like Minsk and Boo to like Ponder, I think it's like kind of somewhere in the middle, right? Like you can definitely beat a resolved Fable the Mirrorbreaker. Like it's really good, it accrues a lot of value, but it's not like it invalidates your entire game plan. And so just not including those cards that are like more expensive, more higher in the mana value curve means that, yeah, the most insanely impactful 3-drop still only has kind of like a manageable impact on the game state because, you know, it only costs 3 mana. That's really, I think, the most important idea. All my other cubes are wildly high power level delta. The Neoclassical cube has Library of Alexandria in it and like so many dinky crappy creatures, like a Whip Quarter. Whip Quarter is in there alongside Library of Alexandria, like and also Mishra's Workshop. Like that's insane. That's a crazy power level delta. We've talked about Sacred Geometry at length. 100 Ornithopters has a pretty crazy power level delta. That's maybe too unique of a use case to bother spending a lot of time talking about, but there are definitely cards in that cube that I think are much higher, you know, win rates or higher power outliers than power in vintage cubes because that's such a unique context. So I actually think that like for a long time, I, as a designer, would have said, like, yeah, for all the reasons you kind of were alluding to, like, I want all the cards to matter and be in dialogue with each other, and I don't want, like, forced picks or whatever. I would have said that I did like a lower power level band, but actually, it's taken however long my cube design life has been to realize that actually that's not what I care about. What I care about is this absolute game impact. I don't want one piece of cardboard, no matter what mana cost, to just have a huge warping absolute game impact.
Definitely, and I think that you're right that if we just look at the pool of all Magic cards, the cards that fit that description of now we're taking over the game entirely is going to be at the higher end of the mana curve.
And also printed recently.
Probably. So it's like, I think you're totally right that also focusing where are those things that are on the higher end of the power level, if you focus those towards the lower end of the mana curve, you're much more likely to have cards that are more easily interactable. Like, here's your Ragavan. Card's insane. Like, card can just snowball and take over a game.
But then you just play a Whip Quarter, and it's like, it will train in combat with Whip Quarter.
What am I thinking of? Young Wolf, is that the one with Persist?
Yeah,
or,
sure.
A
great
Lava
example.
Dart. Like, there are just lots of individual cards that can then answer it. So, keeping your high power level cards at the 1, 2, 3 mana level and having plenty of interaction so that they are not things that just make the game all about them means that you can be much more tolerant of a higher power level band and still have all the cards feel like they are meaningfully part of the same environment that makes sense together and are fun to play with.
And there's also something too about, like, I don't know how much of a different category it is, but the Demonic Tutors and the Brainstorms and the Ponders and whatever that are just like purely enabling your game plan.
Right.
Like, they have no absolute impact on the game because they are only relative to what's in your deck. Like, there is no absolute impact of those cards. They just only make your deck a little better at doing what it's doing. So in a sense, you could put those in a cube with huge power outliers in an absolute sense, and maybe they would feel just as bad. If you're always Demonic Tutoring for the one card your opponent has no answer for and you're just casting it, that doesn't feel that good. That probably, is a similarly negative play pattern. But if you put it in a cube where the power level outliers are all relatively, small ball in terms of their absolute game impact, or they're relative to the environment because they care about, interacting with other cards, then they just become this sort of smoothing thing, which I think is almost a universal good. Like, I really struggle to think of a cube where it's like, I just think Ponder would be toxic to this environment. Maybe that's just my bias. It's the type of Magic I like to play. I don't know. It's kind of like good mana fixing.
The Future Sight cube.
It's just kind of like good mana fixing, right? Like, I struggle to think of cubes where it's like, actually, your mana fixing being really bad, aside from like really thematic desert cubes or whatever. If it's a kind of normal cube where like lands are not a, sought after resource, it's like, I kind of feel like everyone's mana being better just kind of helps everybody's deck, right? In the same way that like everybody having access to like powerful cards to just like control, card selection, card advantage, or card whatever is just a thing that kind of helps everybody.
So something else that you alluded to, which I think is a really, really good way to think about it and is very impactful, is that power level distribution is not just going to be, 5 even chunks. It's going to have some kind of curve to it. I think if we take two examples, one is the very sort of linear curve of we have the same amount of cards at each kind of bucket in the histogram versus having kind of flat and then kind of a spike of here's a couple outliers that are going to be really strong cards. I think those environments are going to play very differently because I think you're much more likely in the first example to have just like, that chunk of bottom 10, 20% of cards that just don't make as much sense, aren't generally going to be played. I think if you have just a couple spikes of power level, it feels more like, okay, most of the cards make sense together, they're all going to be kind of playable, and then every once in a while there's going to be something big and impactful that's going to come in and change the game. And I think that if you combine that with also having those power outliers be things that are answerable, okay, you played your huge thing, this is very exciting that you potentially can run away with this game, it's also possible for me to have a Doomblade and for me to be able to come back from this. So I feel like that's the kind of thing that you can do as a designer to change the way two things that in one definition have a similar power band but play very differently because of that difference in texture and that like curve of power level.
And I think if we look at Sacred Geometry and the Neoclassical Cube, that is where I am basically making sure the power outliers are not having a huge absolute game impact. They're enablers, they're, relative cards that scale with the cards that are in your deck. They just kind of enable your game plan. And that's how I'm sort of mitigating an otherwise really wide power level delta between Whip Quarter and Library of Alexandria or whatever. In 100 Ornithopters, I think it's actually the opposite. Here I'm caring so much more about that distribution. And what I found is like, Gaia's Cradle is obscene. Tolarian Academy is obscene. Echoing Boon is really obscene. But in that cube, I would say there's probably like 20 to 30 cards that are like in conversation for like as obscene. Your Glimpse of Natures, your Ad Nauseums, your Paradoxical Outcomes, your, gosh, I think Tempest Technique, honestly, is like up in that conversation, right?
That's the Storm one that just gives everything like plus one
Storm
for every aura.
Yeah. I think every Disenchant is also in discussion for being as powerful as those other power outliers, basically. That's because that's a cube that's like very specific in its goals. And I think part of the fun, especially like being the like canonical first 100 Ornithopter's cube, it's possible other variations of this cube that have like limited power level delta would actually be like have more replayability and be more fun. But I feel like part of the fun for me and for being like the cube is like, of course you want to play aura shards. Like, that's why the cube is a thing. Of course you want to play these like broken cards. I just found that I wanted to include a density of them such that every player's got to crack it like 2 to 4 of them for their deck, right? It's a matter of like everybody getting to do some broken stuff rather than just being like, sorry, there are 6 power outliers in the cube. And statistically, that means that one player is going to get 2 to 3 of them every draft and their deck is going to be just way better than yours. Here, it's like everybody gets to do some broken stuff, and that distribution, I think, is one of the ways I can balance and forgive an otherwise really big power level delta.
And that reminds me of sort of my, I'll say this carefully, in my irregular cube, where I have a separate rare module of generally higher powered cards that get included. There was a very explicit way that we could tweak kind of like what that power level curve looked like, because we could say like, let's seed every pack with a single rare card or seed it with 3, and it dramatically impacted the way that the games felt. And it was much more fun gameplay when it felt like everybody had their 2 or 3 powerful cards in their deck that was their goal. It's like, okay, if I get to draw this card and make that work, I'm going to have a good time. If you were instead in that sort of like in-between situation where it's like, well, my opponent has 2 really powerful cards that I can't beat and I have none, that sucks.
Yes.
So like
2 to none, it feels really bad.
Getting that curve right where it's like, okay, everybody has some like their own little side quest to accomplish, but minigames are not necessarily going to be about just this one huge card that's taking over the whole game, is something that's difficult, but like, yeah, you can practice, iterate on your cube, and get to a place that feels good. And that touches on another thing, which is just, we come back to again and again on the show, with just that setting expectations is so important. I think that like the worst kind of feels bad of a huge power outlier is, oh my god, that was in this cube, I never even had a chance to see this, I had no chance to plan around it, and now the game is just over because I know I have zero answer to it.
I've definitely had experiences in cubes where like I go in blind, I don't know what's in the list, I open my first pack, I'm looking at some cards, I go through all of pack 1, I take all of my 15 picks, and I feel like I have a good sense for the environment. Then I open pack 2 and I see 2 cards and I'm like, whoa, okay.
Yeah, we are not drafting the cube I thought we were.
Maybe in that first pack, some of those other players got cards that are way better than I thought existed here, because I just didn't see anything that was like in this sort of stratosphere of like game impact or power level. And that is a bad feeling. Or it's like, gosh, I really hope I see some of those in my colors now, because I thought I was doing okay, but it turns out that there was this like invisible layer of super powerful cards that all got first pick by everybody, or that just weren't enough in the first pack that I didn't realize I wasn't really in dialogue with what's going on here.
Right. And it's worth looking at the vintage cube again and saying like, of course, Black Lotus is so much more powerful than all these other cards. And also, that's probably not even true anymore. Somebody's going to say like, no, Fourth Earlingus is so much better than Black Lotus, or whatever.
That's a good pool. I mean, it's still not super recent, but that's, I think, a really good pool for absolute game impact. Fourth Earlingus is messed up in absolute game impact.
But like, that's what you're signing up for when you play that cube. You're like, I really want that exciting moment of drafting Black Lotus and getting to do something crazy. If everybody has that expectation, then when they lose to Black Lotus, they're like, yep, wasn't me this time, but hopefully the next time. And that's a very different experience if you're drafting cube the way that you and I are often, where we're just like, somebody's brought a new cube this week, we're just going to try it out without really looking at the list. Designing the cube in such a way that there is a consistent and like readable curve of what the power level and that distribution of power level is going to be, so that we don't get just like totally blindsided in match 2, is worth considering and paying attention to, I think.
I think so. I think the distribution of power level is critically important. That was like the minimal notes I made for this episode were like, as I've said, I actually don't think the like delta matters much. I think what matters is the nature of those power outliers and the distribution of them across that histogram of like where the power is located. That's how you make the cards in dialogue, regardless of the sort of range of power level, right? Like, even in the regular cube, yeah, it's narrower, but if everyone agrees on what the bottom 20% of the cards are, they're still going to be the ones that ride sideboards. Like, it does not actually matter. You're kind of like trying
It's an interesting question.
You're trying to achieve mutual playability just by making the differences so different that are so small that like just
that players'
biases will like override them, and they won't be able to figure out what the worst cards are.
Or the noise of the draft.
Yeah, which kind of makes sense, but also in some sense it's like, okay, who cares how relative it is? Like, the worst 20% of cards are always going to be in sideboards, and the way to get them not in sideboards is to do the last thing thing which I want to talk about, which is like taking 100 Ornithopters as an example. A card like Faith's Reward or Second Sunrise is not a power outlier. I would not put it in the top 20% of cards in the cube. I wouldn't take it super highly. But you can build a deck where those two cards become by far the best and most important cards in your deck that are way better than anything else and become huge power outliers. That, to me, is another way to really unlock how you manage this. We've been talking about power level in a vacuum this entire time. Like, here's, the effect on win percentage. But when you give players autonomy over how much that card is going to affect their win percentage based on the decks they put it into, that's where this kind of all gets jumbled up in a really satisfying way as a game designer. Like, as a cube designer, I think you should strive for people looking at Pack 3 saying, well, here's one of the cards that everybody agrees is like top 5 in the entire cube. It's in my colors. But I have this deck that really needs this other card, actually. And so because of what I've drafted prior, my sort of table of how these cards are ranked in terms of their power level is completely jumbled. And now it's actually cards you wouldn't expect to be super high picks are now actually better for my deck than cards that are really strong otherwise. And that's what I don't love about like vintage powered cube is like that doesn't really happen. I think maybe Caleb Gannon would disagree. He's like the only like prominent, Magic player I've seen like pass Moxen in favor of like an enabler or like some part of a combo. But I think generally speaking, everyone's pretty much agreed that like there is no card better for your mono red deck than Mox Ruby. Like you just don't take any, maybe Black Lotus, but you just like you don't take anything over that. And I think if you get to a point where no matter what the best card in your cube is, some player will open it, it'll be on color, but they'll say, I should actually take this instead. That's what I strive for.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that is kind of the landing point here where it's like, it is really satisfying when some of the most powerful cards in an environment are only powerful when you properly build around them. It is so satisfying as a player to have that experience of, I've taken this card and I've really optimized it. I think it's so much more fun as an opponent to see somebody play a card and be like, wow, you really worked for that. Like you drafted that thing that cares about equipment and your deck is just full of enough equipment to make it shine. And that is like so awesome to see and so much more satisfying to play with and against than just, here's my Minskin Boo. The game is all about this now. If you don't have an answer, like it's over.
And that is somewhat subjective. I think some players do kind of like the take turns swinging haymakers at each other
They're not
type
listening
of
to this
gameplay.
podcast.
They might be. We have a lot of listeners to the podcast these days, but I agree with you. And, that's what it comes down to. Even in 100 Ornithopters, I mentioned I have a bunch of power outliers, and they're not all enablers. A lot of them are. A lot of the ones I mentioned are card draw, they're mana production. Like, they're not actually the thing that is, like, actually beating your face in, right? The best cards that actually kill you are, like, Tempest Technique, maybe Court of Garenbrig. The best cards are still mostly enablers, which means that you can make them really good, or they cannot be that good, right? Glimpse of Nature is not always good. You might not have enough Ornithopters in your deck. I mean, you should. Another great example of this is I remember Bones, when he came and drafted this cube in person, he drafted his like classic Disenchantress deck. This was, months and many changes ago when that deck was maybe a little too over-supported. Not maybe, definitely was. He told me after the draft, he's like, I opened Aura Shards in Pack 3 and I was so excited. And then I realized I'm not planning on putting any Ornithopters in my deck, and so this card's actually unplayable for me. So like even Aura Shards, which is a messed up card in that cube, for sure in that sort of super high echelon of like way overtuned power outliers, it's not always going to be that good.
Yeah, I mean, that's a funny flip side. It's like if we're talking about it's fun when cards have a really high ceiling that you can build towards, it kind of implies also that it's fun when there are cards that can fail or not make sense, but that is kind of
for
true.
Sure.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
If I could summarize, I feel like where we both are as cube designers is that like there is this traditional advice that for a cube to be fun and replayable, it makes sense to have a pretty narrow power band. And I think that we both agree that like that's a reasonable sort of first stab at solving some problems that can happen with a very wide power level delta. But there are other ways you can still have a wide range of cards that still are in dialogue with each other. And I think that those ways that we sort of talked about are focusing the high powered cards on things that are enablers rather than just threats, focusing high powered cards lower on the mana curve and things that are more easily interactable with removal, with other forms of interaction, with, being countered by a different kind of threat. Setting expectations, as always, is important, and you can set expectations both just in the message that you're sending by the cards that people are seeing as the packs are going around. Obviously, you can also, in some cases, set expectations just by telling your players, like, look, watch out for Aura Shards, it's going to be a big problem, but you don't necessarily always have that luxury, and your players might not always listen. And also thinking about that distribution of power levels, because that's really going to have a big impact on the way that people's decks feel and the way that the gameplay, in terms of like the frequency of the way that power outliers can come up. Trying to make those power outliers things that also take some work and some building around, so it's not just an individual huge thing that just takes over the game. Is that
Yeah.
a reasonable summary?
I think it is. I disagree with the very first thing you said, which was basically like,
Great.
I think you basically were like, we can all agree that having a narrow power level band helps make things mutually playable.
I think it is a heuristic to approximate getting there.
I, at least for the sake of like discussion and discourse, will just reject that and say that
Perfect.
and
Okay.
say that if anything, it's about absolute game impact. Yes, we can argue all day about whether or not Minsk and Boo is better or worse than Ponder, but you cannot argue that Minsk and Boo has a massively huge game impact and Ponder does not. And to me, that is what matters way more than, win percentage in a vacuum or a time-traveling supercomputer sense. Which all just comes down to how you're defining power level. And I think, honestly, when most players say power level, they mean mostly the win percentage thing, but there's always a twinge of the other, like, absolute power level that kind of sneaks into those evaluations, I think.
Game in hand win rate is a thing that exists because our natural bias is to not notice the game in hand win rate. It's to notice the when does this win the game when it's cast,
Right.
Which is very, very different, and it has a big impact on the way that people think about cards. Do we do it? Is that the power level?
What's the power level distribution going to be in the next cube you design, Anthony? Me trying to get Anthony to design a cube.
Let's take a look. Let's pull up the cube. Oh, Gwen? I'm locked out of my Cube Cobra account again?
Again? Gwen, while we're talking about this, every time I save cube changes, it gives me an error that says that it timed out, but then it didn't time out. And
Ooh.
then I have to refresh the page and it says, oh, your pending deletes are all messed up. Do you want to preserve them or whatever? Then I have to just delete them because they actually were all applied and it was all saved. It's happened to me twice in the last 48 hours.
Is my new cube unlisted?
It better be.
It's going to be pretty wild. It's going to be all over the place. Don't you worry about it. But everything's going to be very low to the ground,
Nice.
interactable,
Nice.
lots of powerful cards that require building around, and expectations are going to be set one way or another.
What do you think the worst card in 100 Ornithopters is? Don't say Ornithopter.
I was going to say Ornithopter.
Do not say Ornithopter.
What's a bad number?
I mean, it's honestly probably one of the, again, bad card. What's the least powerful card is probably one of the ones that's one of those narrow build-arounds. It's sometimes this comes together, but rarely it doesn't actually happen, I don't know. It's hard to say. Maybe Transmogrant's Crown. I'm sorry if I was frustrating to you this episode with my pedantic, well, actually.
No. You were just going faster. I was expecting.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess it's just more and more I'm just who cares?
Who cares?
Honestly, I'm starting to look at power level the same way I look at breaking a rarity restriction, where it's I want to play this card, but it's so powerful. I'm who cares? Do it. Put it in. Especially when it's low in mana value and low in absolute game impact. Sound off in the comments if you have a better way to describe the concept of absolute power level or absolute game impact that will be more resonant to people listening and they will understand the concept more easily. I look forward to all those great suggestions. You can send mail to our P.O. box. I want to shout out somebody. Somebody sent us what are the ones that don't have envelopes? Postcard. Someone sent us a postcard. Someone sent us a postcard that showed up in the informed delivery, and you could kind of read it, but the scan was bad, but then never showed up in the P.O. box. I don't know where. It was 2 weeks ago. It was in informed delivery. Can't read who it was from, but it was written to Lucky Paper Radio. If you sent a postcard, I'm sorry. Hopefully it'll turn up at some point. We've had a lot of bad weather here, so maybe that explains it, but you can send mail to P.O. Box 4855, Baltimore, Maryland, 21211, and we will read it on the show. If you want to support the show on Patreon, you can do so. It is linked in the show notes, and that supports the show. It supports all of our articles on our website that Parker and other contributors are writing. It supports the Cube Fellowship, supports all the stuff we do at Lucky Paper, and that's it for this episode. All the music for this show is produced by DJ James Nasty, and the show is edited by Matthew. All the Magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast, and his podcast is produced by Thinking Really Hard About Magic Cards, and then speaking into microphones about it. Anthony, thank you for the gift of friendship and for the gift of Cube.
Thank you for talking about cubes. And happy Valentine's Day to all who celebrate. Hope you had delightful Valentine's Day.
I bet we have a very romantic, amorous audience.
Absolutely.
Yeah. We really pull that out of people, I think.
Yeah.